Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. Today we are continuing Who Ate the First Oyster by Cody Cassidy. This chapter is called Who Caught the First Case of Smallpox. If the time of our species on Earth were a day, this happened 19 minutes before midnight, or 4,000 years ago. The greatest killer in history is not Genghis Khan, or Alexander the Great, nor is it any one battle, war, or even all wars combined. Rather, it's a single hapless, blameless individual born 4,000 years ago in the Horn of Africa who just so happened to breathe in a novel virus hitching a ride on a speck of dust. Variola, the virus responsible for smallpox, nearly wiped out the New World and took a solid stab at the Old one. In the 18th century, it killed 400,000 Europeans every year. In the 20th century, it killed 3 times as many people as both world wars combined, and played a significant role in the fall of the Aztec and Inca empires after the European sailors introduced it. Variola had no particular predilections. It killed young and old, kings and peasants. Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius died of smallpox, as did Queen Mary II of England. Tsar Peter II of Russia, and King Louis XV of France. Abraham Lincoln came down with smallpox a week after delivering the Gettysburg Address. Smallpox decided wars. In the Franco-Russian conflict, the Germans were vaccinated, the French were not, and nearly half of the French casualties were due to smallpox. Some scholars have called George Washington's order to inoculate all his troops his most important tactical decision of the Revolutionary War. Unlike the Black Plague, smallpox isn't a disease modern medicine has long conquered. If you were to come down with the case tomorrow, a hospital wouldn't improve your chances of survival any more than a witch doctor. And if somebody distributed variola over a modern city, thousands, perhaps millions, would die. In 1972, a single clergyman returning from Mecca sparked an outbreak in Yugoslavia that killed 35 people and sickened 175 before roadblocks, house-to-house searches, curfews, and a declaration of martial law halted the spread. Smallpox is the greatest viral scourge in the history of humankind, and it has left a heavy footprint on our species. In 1959, the World Health Organization, armed with a vaccine, launched a campaign under the direction of the American epidemiologist D.A. Henderson to eliminate smallpox. Because the virus can only infect humans and must infect a new person every 14 days to survive, its eradication was at least theoretically possible, if absurdly ambitious. Wiping a human virus off the planet had never been done before, and for good reason. 3 million viral particles could fit comfortably within the period that concludes this sentence, and in the year the program began, smallpox had infected at least 15 million people. And yet, on October 26, 1977, Henderson and his WHO team had lowered that number to 1. The global hunt had isolated the last of variola within the body of a single person, a Somalian hospital cook named Ali Ma'al Ma'alin. Ma'alin was a 23-year-old man who lived in the town of Merka, Somalia, and worked as a cook in the local hospital. The hospital required its staff to receive the smallpox vaccination, but Ma'alin avoided it, he later said, on account of his fear of needles. So when Ma'alin volunteered to guide 2 smallpox-infected girls on their 15-minute car ride to isolation camp, his immune system was unprepared for the viral onslaught. Initially, local doctors misdiagnosed him with chickenpox and failed to isolate him. By this time, the 2 girls had recovered, so investigators mistakenly believed they had contained the spread. As a result, the popular Ma'alin had no fewer than 91 visitors stop by to wish him well. When doctors realized their mistake, the World Health Organization launched a massive containment team throughout southern Somalia to track down everyone Ma'alin had come into contact with. They established police checkpoints, performed house-to-house searches, quarantined Ma'ala's entire hospital, and administered 50,000 inoculations. And they waited for a new case. 4,000 years before Ma'alin's car ride, variola mutated into existence. The dominant strain began within a single person, in a single cell, in a single horrific moment, and through no fault of their own, this person may be responsible for more human death than anyone who has ever lived. Who was he? I'll call him Patient Zero, the code name doctors use for the originator of plagues, and I'll call him a him because the genetic clues within variola suggest he worked intimately with a domesticated camel near the Horn of Africa at a time and place where men and camels would often live for weeks in herding camps. Patient Zero was born somewhere in modern-day Ethiopia or Eritrea nearly 4,000 years ago, which is a few hundred years after the Egyptian pharaoh Khufu commissioned his Great Pyramid 1,000 miles to the north. Zero's culture had no writing, but direct accounts of the people of the Horn exist thanks to some of the oldest reliefs and hieroglyphs in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians called Zero's home the land of Punt, and Zero a Puntite, and both the Egyptians and the Puntites sailed the Red Sea along one of the world's first maritime trading routes. If the Egyptian reliefs of the Puntite king Parahu are a faithful representation, Patient Zero may have had dark reddish skin with close cropped hair worn beneath a skull cap. Like Parahu, he may have had a long goatee flipped forward. At his side, he may have tucked a dagger into his white bifurcated kilt. Zero would have made his home in a year-round hut, according to the Egyptian reliefs, which he raised on stilts with a ladder to his door, perhaps to protect himself from predators, or maybe to provide an enclosed corral for his animals underneath. He was most likely a pastoralist who cultivated crops and raised a few domesticated animals, including dogs, cattle, donkeys, and camels. Myrrh trees, the sap of which could be burned as incense and was one of the most valued products of ancient Egypt, shaded his house. Demand for myrrh, along with punts, gold, pelts, exotic animals, and slave labor, drew the Egyptians to make long voyage down the Red Sea. The pharaoh Khufu's son himself enslaved a Puntite person. Zero likely lived and worked with his camel, though he did not ride it. Instead, he used it for its milk. A nursing camel can produce up to 5 gallons per day, and some camel herders have survived exclusively on it for weeks. Zero used his camel in the same tradition as the initial domesticators, herding, culture that occupied the southern Arabian Peninsula. Robert Bulliet, the author of The Camel and the Wheel, believes soon after the camel's domestication 5,000 years ago, the camel made its way across the Red Sea in the boats of incense traders. For the ancestor virus of variola, the introduction of the camel provided a tremendous opportunity. For humanity, an incredible risk. Any close contact with an animal's body fluids is a chance for a virus to hop species. Fortunately, different species have different immune systems, and a virus attuned to one is likely ill-suited to attack another. Usually, when a virus finds itself in a foreign species, it's like a human on Mars without a spacesuit, writes virologist Nathan Wolfe. It withers and dies, or is simply identified and destroyed by the new immune system, or, more dangerously for the host, it replicates but is not contagious. To successfully switch hosts, a virus must acquire variations that allow it to multiply and transmit in a new environment. A virus can do this in a variety of ways, either through its own mutations, or in some cases, two different viruses can infect the same cell and combine to form a new one. By now, virologists believe we have been so thoroughly exposed to the primary diseases infecting dogs, pigs, and the rest of the domesticated animals that any disease of theirs that could feasibly hop into humans already has. Today, the primary viral danger from domesticated animals come from their serving as a middleman between humans and the viruses of wild animals. However, in Zero's era, the recent domestication and introduction of the camel into a new environment put the human species at risk. The camel gave the local viruses a new immune system to attack, and the domestication brought day-to-day contact between humans and camels, providing millions of opportunities for viral introduction. The precise ancestor of the variola virus is unknown. Donald R. Hopkins, leader of the World Health Organization's Smallpox eradication team, suspects a pox virus that infected rodents because of a particular gene found within variola for encoding mouse protein. This is likely a remnant of a previous life he uses in his book, The Greatest Killer. Recent genetic research appears to support the notion that the direct ancestor virus to variola likely infected a now extinct African rodent, perhaps a gerbil of some kind, but that the camel's immune system played the role of the maitre d'. Igor Babkin, a geneticist at the Institute of Chemical Biology in Novosibirsk, Russia, and author of the paper The Origin of the Variola Virus, tells me the introduction of camels provided a stepping stone from the rodents to humans. Babkin believes the process of attacking the camel's immune system triggered an evolution in the virus. As the gerbil's pox virus replicated within the camel, he believes it picked up some new piece of genetic material that turned what had been merely a viral nuisance into a monster. No one knows how Zero caught the first divergent strain from the African rodent. It could have been from butchering and eating it, as Hopkins speculates, or, as Stanford professor of immunology Robert Siegel tells me, it could have been from something as innocuous as breathing the wrong puff of dust. Dried rodent droppings become aerosolized in dust and can drift into lungs, which is how the hantavirus pulmonary syndrome is contracted. Whatever the case, inside Zero, the novel environment would have been the virus's end. Except this time, thanks to bad luck and some new trick it picked up from the camels, the new pox virus not only survived within Zero, but thrived. Once inside Zero's throat, Variola's viral grenade would have latched on to cells in his mucous membranes and begun replicating. Under a microscope, a variola-infected cell undergoes a hideous transformation, morphing from a smooth ball into a spiked jack. The hollow spikes stretch out from the cell like spears hunting for healthy cells to impale. Once they strike, the hollow passageways within the spikes serve as tunnels for viral particles to hide from attacking white blood cells. Once inside the next cell, the process begins anew. At first, Zero's immune system would have suspected nothing. Virologists aren't sure where the virus hides for the first 7 to 10 days, but many suspect it replicates within the lymph nodes, lulling the immune system into passivity while the virus grows exponentially. After more than a week of unabated growth, the viral particles burst forth and ride the bloodstream to the nearest organs. At this stage, Zero's immune system would mount its first defense, and he would feel the first symptoms. It would start as a fever and a headache, followed quickly by a sore throat which would mark the beginning of Zero's infectiousness. Lesions in his throat would sprout viral grenades, each teeming with particles that would ride his microscopic spittle into air to create a 10-foot viral hot zone. He might have confused his symptoms for the flu, but when the virus began to attack his skin and distinctive red spots appeared, something he may have suspected something far more serious. Soon the spots would have filled with pus. Then he would have begun to smell. William Fagey, an epidemiologist on the World Health Organization eradication team, writes in his book House on Fire that twice he was able to identify a smallpox patient inside a house from as far away as the sidewalk based only on the smell. He describes the odor as reminiscent of the smell of a dead animal. No one knows what causes it. Perhaps, he proposes, it's the rotting pustules. The pain is agony. Patients with smallpox wear almost nothing as cloths touch on their skin can burst open a pustule. At this stage, writes Fagey, the most patients simply want to die. Variola didn't intend to kill Zero. According to Fagey, the virus carried no ill will. It was simply responding to the drive to perpetuate itself. Nevertheless, a patient infected with variola is in a fight to the death. Either Zero's immune system destroyed it, or variola would have destroyed him. Immunologists are unsure of the lethality of the virus in the initial spillover event. The thousands of years it spent replicating in humans have changed it dramatically, but if variola followed the typical pattern, Zero's infection may have been an even deadlier version than the modern one. Typically, the more recent a viral spillover, the more lethal, because from a viral perspective, the death of its host is suboptimal. A virus seeks to replicate and spread, and a dead host no longer mingles with potential new ones. As a result, viruses often decrease in lethality the more time they spend in a host as more infectious variants become the dominant strain. Thousands of years after the initial spillover, a variation of variola called variola minor evolved, which had a death rate of only 1% compared to variola major's 30%. Unfortunately for Zero, he is likely to have had a far more lethal case than is modernly known, and more likely than not succumbed. But variola lived on. At some point during his infection, or even after his death if someone handled Zero's body, the virus found a new host to infect. In many cases, this would have been a family member. By modern times, when variola had fine-tuned itself to humans, a caring family member stood a 50% chance of catching the disease, according to Fagey. But most virologists believe in its early stages variola was both more lethal and less adept at leaping between human hosts. As Hopkins writes in The Greatest Killer about the initial infections, if the pattern of adaptation of other diseases for animals to man may be presumed to have been followed in this case, spread from one person to another would have been rare at first. Virologists refer to a virus's transmission rate as its R naught. R naught measures the average number of individuals a sick patient infects. A disease with an R naught of less than 1 will eventually die out, while a disease with an R naught of greater than 1 will spread. The higher the R naught, the greater the risk of an epidemic. Modern-day variola has an R naught of 6, which is roughly the equivalent of the common cold. Initially, Henderson believes variola's R naught was likely to have been significantly lower, but its persistence is proof that it was higher than 1, and as it spread within humans, it adapted to them. It improved its transmission rate by working against our immune system like a hacker being brute forcing a password. As it replicated trillions of times and made millions of mistakes, the virus would occasionally stumble upon natural selection, an improved variation, and increase its rate of infection. Through natural selection, the new version would soon become the dominant one, and the process would repeat. There is no intelligence beyond its adaptations. The virus is a million monkeys in front of keyboards, and variola is their Hamlet. If Zero had simply lived in a small village, as humans have done for most of our history, the disease would have burned through the population and died out after killing or immunizing everyone. Smallpox, like all highly infectious diseases, requires a large population to perpetuate itself. Researchers estimate variola required populations of at least 200,000 people within 14 days of travel to self-sustain. Scholars believe there's little chance of variola succeeding prior to the agricultural revolution because population densities of that magnitude are a relatively recent development. Prior to farming, diseases too horrible to contemplate likely streaked through small communities, ran out of new hosts, and died. But variola happened to leap into our species at one of the first times in history when populations of those numbers lived within that proximity, the dawn of the global economy, when pastoralists created some of the first large-scale communities in the Horn of Africa, and when Egyptians and Puntites opened one of the first maritime trading routes. The disease could have percolated within the Horn for years before riding up the Red Sea in the body of an enslaved Puntite or one of the Egyptian traders. Once it landed in the Nile River Valley, where 4,000 years ago the population was over 1 million, the virus would have been unstoppable. The first confirmed cases of smallpox come from the pustules virologists have identified on 3 Egyptian mummies. 2 were anonymous Egyptian officials mummified 3,598 years ago and 3,218 years ago, while the third and most famous case is that of the Pharaoh Ramses V, who died 3,175 years ago. Hieroglyphs describe Ramses as dying of an acute illness, and when Henderson inspected the mummy, he discovered smallpox indicative pustules covering his face, neck, and shoulders. Once in Egypt, the disease would have spread throughout the world. Approximately 3,400 years ago, the Hittites from Turkey fought the Egyptian army, and their cuneiform tablets describe a disease brought on by their Egyptian captives. Egyptian traders are among the incense trade. Egyptian traders along the incense trade route appear to have taken variola with them to India, where the ancient medical treatises Sharakat Samhita and Sashruta Samhita describe smallpox in detail. Variola made it to China by 2,500 years ago, just before the building of the Great Wall, and in the 16th century, Spanish explorers introduced it into the New World, where its effects were particularly catastrophic. In outbreaks, immunized people reduced their R0 of a virus and therefore decreased the disease's exponential growth. But because no one in the New World had survived an infection and became immunized, the initial outbreak was apocalyptic. The fight against variola stretches back into antiquity. It was long understood that no one ever caught smallpox twice, but the Chinese were the first to use the weakness against the virus. According to the British biochemist and medical historian Joseph Needham, the first time that anyone anywhere in the world performed an inoculation, that is, intentionally infected a patient with a weakened form of virus in order to confer immunity occurred in China approximately 1,000 years ago. The first mention of inoculation is found in a 14th century Chinese medical treatise. We do not know the names of we do not know now the names of the inoculators, but they get it from an eccentric and extraordinary man who had himself derived it from the alchemical adepts. Since then it has spread widely all over the country. This extraordinary man did nothing less than invent immunology, which remains humankind's greatest defense against the virus. Variola's critical weakness is not only that a person cannot be infected twice, but that dried pustules of a previously infected patient are naturally attenuated, meaning many of the viral particles have died off. Because the virus grows exponentially, fewer viral particles in the initial infection reduces the severity of the disease. The difference in mortality is dramatic, as inoculated patients stood a 1 to 2% chance of death compared to a 30% for patients who were naturally infected. By the 17th century, inoculation in China and India was widespread. Doctors in China had published manuals on the procedure, and a century later acknowledged the practice made its way into Europe. Inoculations, however, were far from perfect. If the doctor doesn't use properly dried scabs, for instance, they will infect their patient with full-strength smallpox. Even worse, an inoculated patient is as contagious and deadly as a traditionally infected one, while their immune system fights off the disease. In many cases, inoculations sparked outbreaks. The beginning of the end for variola occurred on May 14th, 1796, when Dr. Edwin Jenner tested a local inoculator's report of his inoculation's ineffectiveness on a few local farmers. The farmers swore they had never contracted smallpox, but had recently come down with a bovine version of pox virus called cowpox. Cowpox infects humans, and the rest isn't pleasant, but it doesn't spread human to human and is rarely lethal. The inoculator's report sparked the beginnings of an idea in Jenner, and to test his theory, he inoculated an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps with cowpox. Like in an inoculation of variola, Jenner attenuated the pustules of cowpox. The result was that Phipps didn't contract full-blown, uncomfortable cowpox, but instead only a single tiny pustule formed on his arm. And yet, remarkably, when Jenner then administered a traditional variola inoculation, Phipps had no reaction at all. Unlike variola inoculations, cowpox inoculations had a mortality rate of near zero, didn't cause subsequent outbreaks of smallpox, and only resulted in a single pustule rather than a week in the infirmary. Doctors later discovered an even better pox virus for variola inoculation called vaccinia virus and termed the procedure of vaccination. Despite the vaccine, variola persisted. In the 20th century alone, it may have killed as many as 500 million people before an 18-year global hunt by the World Health Organization isolated the virus in the body of Ali Ma'al. Luckily, Ma'alin's immune system gradually gained the upper hand against the virus. Even more remarkably, none of the 91 different people Ma'alin had come in contact with had come down with the disease. So on November 1st, 1977, the last cell of variola virus, scourged to humanity for nearly 4,000 years, died at the hands of Ma'alin's autoimmune system, or immune system. Addendum. At least 2 vials of the virus live on, one in a biolab in Atlanta, Georgia, and the other in Novosibirsk, Russia. No nation has acknowledged developing variola as a weapon, but in 1971, a Soviet field test of smallpox bioweapon drilled into a fishing vessel in Uralsk, killing 3. And while Ma'alin was the last to contract the disease naturally, in 1978 at the University of Birmingham, England, variola escaped through the lab's ventilation system into an upstairs office where it infected and killed a medical photographer named Janet Parker. Because the widespread vaccination for smallpox ceased in 1973, most of the world's population is once again vulnerable to the virus. That is the end of that chapter. If you like it, please check out the playlist for the rest of these chapters from this book and like and subscribe.